The year was 1886, and the world was already standing at the uneasy threshold between old superstition and the rising power of science. Electricity flickered for the first time in wealthy homes, doctors whispered of new medical discoveries, and the shadows of the Victorian age clung tightly to every cobblestone street. Yet, while progress marched forward, fear never left. It lingered in every alleyway, in every darkened window, and in the hidden corners of families who carried chilling secrets. And it was in this uneasy time that a boy was born, one who would come to be remembered not for his brilliance in school, not for his talent with numbers or machines, but for something far more disturbing. He studied death as if it were a science. Old photos that survive from this era reveal the rigid faces of Victorian families, mothers clutching infants, fathers staring sternly into the lens, and, more unsettling still, the lifeless children captured in post-mortem photography. The practice was common then, dressing the dead in their finest clothes, propping them up for one final portrait. For many families, it was the only photograph they would ever own of their loved one. But for this boy, those photographs were not symbols of grief. They were data. They were lessons. Each disturbing image was something to be examined, measured, and catalogued. Imagine him as a child, no more than 9 or 10, standing silently in a candlelit room while his neighbors wept over a vanished child. Others cried, prayed, or turned their faces away. He did not. He leaned in. He watched. His eyes traced the eerie details, the cooling of skin, the stiffening of limbs, the haunting stillness of eyes that would never open again. What terrified others fascinated him. He whispered once, according to an old diary fragment, "If death has rules, then I will find them." The town he grew up in was quiet, a place of stone churches, cobbled paths, and damp fog rolling from the river. But beneath its simple surface, it was a place heavy with superstition. People believed in haunted places, in forbidden languages whispered by the old, and in curses that clung to certain families. Within this backdrop of fear and faith, the boy's fascination grew. His neighbors began to notice him at funerals. Too often. Too close. Watching every detail. One witness, whose account was uncovered in a faded newspaper clipping, described seeing the boy at the graveside of a young girl. He stood very still, his small notebook open, and though the priest read prayers, the boy wrote, "I do not know what." The priest himself later told the family that he had never seen a child stare so intently at the face of the dead. From an early age, he began creating what can only be called a catalog of mortality. His notebooks, some still preserved in archives, their pages fragile with age, contain unsettling sketches. The slant of a jaw, the hollow of an eye socket, the precise timing between a last breath and stillness. This was not the curiosity of a child who feared death. This was the obsession of one who believed death could be studied, tested, perhaps even mastered. In the eerie light of oil lamps, he filled page after page. Some writings were clinical, almost detached. Others descended into strange philosophy. He spoke of death as if it were not an ending, but a locked door with a key hidden in plain sight. He believed that if one observed closely enough, measured deeply enough, the hidden truth would be revealed. The boy's family, a strange family in its own right, struggled to understand him. His father dismissed his behavior as morbid intelligence. His mother defended him, whispering that he was simply too clever for his age. But in the community, whispers grew darker. They called him cursed. They said he spoke in a forbidden language during his sleep, words no one could recognize. And they noticed that whenever a child vanished, whether to fever, accident, or unexplained disappearance, he was always present, watching. One chilling rumor claimed that he kept small tokens from the dead, buttons, ribbons, even locks of hair, items that later appeared pressed between the pages of his notes. If true, then his obsession had already crossed the line from observation into possession. And yet there was something about his presence that drew people in. Teachers called him brilliant, a genius beyond his years. He could recite entire passages of anatomy texts and explain the structure of the human body with eerie precision. His fascination with death was, to some, simply the curiosity of a scientific mind. But to others, it was the mark of something sinister, something that could not be explained by reason alone. Look closely at one of the surviving photographs often linked to his story. At first glance, it appears ordinary, a stern Victorian family seated stiffly for their portrait. But study the boy's face. His expression is not of boredom, nor pride. His eyes are cold, focused, almost as if he is not looking at the camera at all, but beyond it, into something only he can see. And this was only the beginning. His notebooks, his fascination with post-mortem photography, his obsession with documenting the dying, these were not passing phases. They were the first steps in a descent into something darker, something that would shake the town and leave behind questions that remain unsolved mysteries to this day. The boy who studied death like science was no ordinary child, and what he would go on to do in the years that followed would blur the line between genius and something far more disturbing. The year was still 1886, and while the outside world hummed with industry and invention, the boy's small town lived in the grip of something far more unsettling. To outsiders, it was just another European settlement, narrow cobblestone lanes, smoke curling from chimneys, the echo of church bells marking the slow passage of days. But to those who lived there, the town carried an unease, and that unease had a name: the boy. Even as a child, he was different. Too quiet, too watchful. His schoolmates told stories of how he stared for hours at old photos in dusty albums, not of living relatives, but of the post-mortem photography his family kept tucked away. Where other children shuddered at disturbing images of lifeless infants propped upright beside grieving mothers, he leaned closer. He traced the eerie details with his finger, studying the hollow eyes, the rigid posture, the stillness that only death could bring. For him, each photograph was not memory, it was research. And in a town bound by superstition, that fascination did not go unnoticed. Families whispered about his habits. Neighbors claimed they saw him wandering graveyards long after sunset, his small frame illuminated only by the glow of a lantern. They said he paused at every stone, scribbling notes into his ever-present journal, as though the graves themselves were teachers and he, their devoted student. This was no harmless curiosity. It became part of the town's identity, a shadow they could not escape. The boy's presence at funerals was as expected as the tolling of the church bell. Mothers clutched their vanished children tighter when he appeared, as if his very gaze carried bad luck. One mourner recalled that when her infant daughter was laid out for the final blessing, the boy leaned so close she thought he might whisper to the dead child. She later described the moment with trembling words. He watched her like one examines a book, as if she would answer him. The family's home itself became a source of rumor. A modest house with lace curtains and ivy climbing its walls, yet people spoke of strange noises drifting from its attic, the scratching of pens long into the night, the muffled thud of something being moved. Some swore they smelled decay near the windows. It was said the boy's parents dared not open the attic door, for they already feared what secrets he was keeping there. Teachers praised him as a genius. His grasp of mathematics, anatomy, and natural sciences surpassed even the older students. But praise was always delivered with an ease, as if the brilliance they admired carried a weight too heavy for his years. He asked questions no child should ask. Questions about decomposition, about the exact moment a soul leaves the body, about whether death was truly final, or simply another state to be measured. The line between education and obsession grew thinner each day. Classmates described his notebooks not as lessons, but as catalogs of horror. Inside were precise sketches of bodies, not imagined but remembered. Scribbled observations of illness, the timing of coughs, the pallor of skin as fevers worsened. To read them was to step into a mind that viewed tragedy as opportunity. It was during this time that the whispers of haunted places spread further. Children claimed the boy lured them into cemeteries with promises of secret games, only to abandon them among the gravestones, laughing softly in the fog. A few swore he spoke to them in a strange, forbidden language, muttering words no one could understand. as though repeating something he had heard whispered in dreams. One disturbing account came from a local gravedigger who claimed to see the boy sitting silently atop a newly filled grave, writing feverishly by moonlight. When confronted, the boy smiled and replied, "I'm not writing about the dead. I'm writing about what they leave behind." To the town, this was more than eccentricity. It was a creeping dread, a horror storytelling itself into daily life. Every vanished child, every disturbing image, every eerie family portrait seemed tied to him by invisible threads. He was not yet accused of any crime. No evidence placed him at the center of tragedy. But fear does not wait for proof. Fear grows in silence, in glances, in the haunting sense that something is wrong. And so the boy became a figure of dark history within his own lifetime, still alive, still walking the streets, yet already a ghost in the minds of his neighbors. Parents warned their children not to stare at him, not to speak to him, not even to let their shadows cross his. They whispered that genius was a curse, that it had made him into something neither child nor man, but an in-between creature obsessed with secrets no one should know. Look closely at the rare surviving photograph of his school group. At first glance, it looks ordinary. Children pose stiffly with their teacher, faces blurred by the long exposure. But there, on the far right, he stands apart, slightly turned, his expression cold, unreadable. His classmates fidget or squint at the camera. He does not. His eyes are sharp, focused, as though he is not looking at the photographer at all, but through him, searching for something invisible, something hidden in the shadows. The boy was alive, yes, but to his town, he had already crossed over. And what he would do next would only deepen the fear that clung to his name, binding him forever to unsettling history and sinister past. From the moment he could hold a pen, the boy seemed determined to capture the one thing everyone else feared to face, death itself. What began as an unusual curiosity soon hardened into his first true obsession. It started with books. While other children memorized hymns and simple lessons, he devoured anatomy texts borrowed from physicians, their pages filled with diagrams of skeletons, organs, and failing hearts. He underlined passages on the stages of decomposition. He copied sketches of bones with unnerving precision, the lines of his pencil almost too steady for a child's hand. To him, these were not grim images. They were lessons. But the written word was only the beginning. He craved the physical truth that no book could provide. Whenever a neighbor fell ill, he lingered nearby, his journal pressed against his chest, waiting to record every symptom, every cough, every change in skin tone. To those around him, it looked like pity. But to those who watched closer, it was study. At school, he startled his teacher by declaring, "Death is not the end. It is a process. And every process has rules." The class fell silent. Children shuffled in their seats, too afraid to laugh, too disturbed to speak. The teacher scolded him, but privately admitted the boy's mind was far sharper than his own. Soon, his notebooks turned into something chilling. On the pages were not only words, but tables, calculations, and timelines. He documented the precise hours between a final breath and the stiffening of limbs. He charted how eyes dulled, how mouths collapsed inward, how silence thickened in a room once the living spirit was gone. Each observation was logged with the care of a scientist, but carried the tone of something far darker. At night, his family heard the scratching of his pen long after the house had gone quiet. His mother once described entering his room and finding him surrounded by scraps of paper, candlelight flickering across sketches of lifeless figures. She begged him to stop, to think of lighter things. He only smiled and replied, "Lighter things die too. I just want to understand how." The townspeople began to notice small, disturbing patterns. He visited funerals not as a mourner, but as an observer. He leaned closer to the open caskets, sometimes too close, his eyes darting across the faces of the dead as if searching for hidden truth. A mother claimed she saw him counting under his breath at her child's wake, his fingers tapping a rhythm against the coffin's edge. When asked what he was doing, he simply answered, "Measuring." Old photos from this period reveal his unsettling focus. In one class portrait, the other children squirm and fidget, their blurred faces a testament to impatience. But his image is sharp. His eyes stare not at the photographer, but at something far beyond. It is the gaze of someone already lost in thought, already writing the next page of a private experiment. Whispers spread that he had begun collecting tokens from the dead. A ribbon here, a button there, pressed between the pages of his journals like strange bookmarks. One rumor claimed he even sketched the outline of a girl's hand as she lay in her coffin, tracing each finger with clinical detail before closing the book. The family never spoke of it, but the story persisted, growing darker each time it was told. His obsession also found its way into strange philosophies. In one notebook fragment, he wrote, "Fear of death is wasted. It is the most common event in the world, and yet the least understood. Why mourn when you can measure? Why cry when you can calculate?" These words, discovered years later, carried the weight of a mind both brilliant and unsettling, a child who no longer saw death as tragedy but as opportunity. Even the places he chose to linger grew more ominous. Children dared each other to follow him into the cemetery, where he sat among the stones with lantern light flickering across his pale face. He never looked startled when others appeared. Instead, he welcomed them, asking if they had ever thought about how long a soul might hover before it left. Many ran from him, chilled to the bone by his calm voice in such a haunted place. The town had begun to fear him, but fear is not always loud. It is quiet, heavy, spoken in hushed voices behind closed doors. They said genius had twisted him, that his strange family allowed too much freedom, that his journals were filled with forbidden language not meant for mortal eyes. But still, no one dared confront him directly. He was, after all, just a boy with an intelligence that demanded respect, and a boy whose interests lay in shadows no one else dared to enter. One surviving page from his notebooks ends with a single line written larger than all the rest. "Every death is an experiment, and every experiment brings me closer." Closer to what? No one could say. But the people of the town were beginning to realize that whatever path he walked, it would not end with childhood curiosity. It would lead deeper, into darkness, into mysteries that should have been left forgotten. And his first obsession was only the beginning. There are some houses that look ordinary from the street, curtains drawn, shutters closed, ivy creeping across brick. But within their walls, secrets breed in silence. His family's home was one of them. By day, it was no different from any other. A father reading the newspaper, a mother mending clothes, the faint sound of a piano played badly in the parlor. But by night, the house grew strange. Candles burned too late. Shadows moved against the attic windows. And from behind the thin wooden walls, neighbors swore they heard the scratching of pens, the shifting of furniture, and at times, muffled thuds that did not belong. The boy had retreated to the upper floor of that house, claiming the attic as his own. It was here that his curiosity transformed into something far more disturbing: experiments in silence. The attic was small, the ceiling slanted low, dust thick on the beams. By lamplight, he arranged jars and boxes, each labeled with a child's precise handwriting. Inside were insects pinned in neat rows, small birds laid out on scraps of cloth, and the bones of animals he had found or taken. Each specimen was catalogued, measured, and observed. He studied their last movements, noting the way wings stiffened or how quickly eyes clouded. To him, every dying creature was another chapter in a private textbook. And yet, the silence of his experiments was not always complete. Some nights, faint chirps or whimpers echoed from the attic, cut short by his deliberate hand. The family pretended not to hear, though his mother later admitted in a shaken voice, "I knew something was wrong, but I did not dare stop him." It felt forbidden. Rumors began to spread through the town. Pets vanished, cats, dogs, even hens from the neighbors' yards. Children whispered of seeing him carrying bundles wrapped in cloth, slipping through alleys after dark, his lantern casting an eerie glow on the cobblestones. When asked, he smiled politely and said nothing. That smile, so calm and measured, chilled people more than a denial ever could. His journals from this period are perhaps the most disturbing of all. Pages filled with diagrams of skeletal structures, tables recording heartbeats against time, notes written with the patience of a doctor, but the imagination of a child lost in darkness. One line reads, "The body speaks if you listen. The silence after life is not empty, it is full of hidden truth." Neighbors began to avoid the house. Children crossed to the other side of the street rather than glance at the attic windows. And yet, the boy's father still praised his brilliance, showing his school essays to visitors as proof of a genius son. No one dared suggest aloud that genius and madness might be one and the same. Look closely at the surviving photograph of the house. At first glance, it is just another faded image, a mother seated with her children in front of ivy-covered brick. But study the upper window, just above their heads. There, half in shadow, the faint outline of a face can be seen, pale, motionless, watching. Some say it was only a trick of light, a stain on the old glass. Others insist it was him, always watching, always waiting, even when the camera turned away. One of the most chilling accounts came from a maid employed briefly by the family. She described entering the attic to clean, only to find notebooks spread across the floor. In them were sketches not of animals, but of people, neighbors, classmates, even the maid herself, drawn as if they were corpses. She fled the house that very night and refused to ever return. When asked why, she simply said, "There are some children you should not look in the eye." He was one of them. The silence of his attic was no ordinary quiet. It was the silence of endings, the hush that follows the last cry of a bird, the moment after the final breath of a small animal. He lived inside that silence, writing it down, measuring it, shaping it into knowledge only he understood. The attic had become his sanctuary, his laboratory, his shrine to what others feared most. And yet, his obsession did not stop at animals. In one notebook entry, he scrawled a single unsettling sentence across the page. "The next step is human." Whether he meant observation, measurement, or something far more sinister, no one knew. The line was never explained. But from that moment forward, the town's unease deepened into dread. If he could study death in silence for so long, what would he do next? The attic remained locked to outsiders. The family never spoke of what they heard, and the boy himself, polite and brilliant in public, carried on as if nothing was wrong. But behind the closed door of that room, experiments in silence continued, night after night, until the house itself seemed to breathe with an unseen presence. And when the silence finally broke, it would terrify everyone who heard it. Every town has one house that seems to hold its breath. Curtains drawn too tightly, windows that never open, a silence that lingers even in daylight. For this town, that house belonged to the boy and his family. From the outside, it looked like any other, brick walls weathered by rain, ivy crawling slowly across the facade, a narrow path leading to a wooden door worn by years of knocks. But inside, something else stirred. Something the family never spoke of aloud. The house itself seemed to grow darker as his obsession deepened. His parents had once welcomed neighbors in for tea, the parlor bright with lace and laughter. But now, the shutters stayed closed, the air stale. Visitors rarely crossed the threshold, and those who did whispered later that they felt unwelcome, not by rudeness, but by an invisible weight pressing down on the rooms. A presence that watched without blinking. His father grew restless, pacing the halls at night, muttering about the boy's notebooks scattered across every surface. His mother, once his fiercest defender, began to lose her voice in his defense. She admitted in hushed tones to a cousin that her son spoke in his sleep, muttering words she did not understand, a forbidden language that chilled her blood. The younger children, if there were any, avoided him entirely, creeping around the edges of the house as though their brother's shadow might swallow them whole. But it was not just within the family. Neighbors passing by swore they saw flickering candlelight from the attic at impossible hours, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. One woman claimed she heard a single, sharp cry in the dead of night, cut short so suddenly that silence fell heavier than before. No one investigated. No one dared. The boy himself was polite, calm, and unnervingly controlled. At the dinner table he ate without a word, eyes distant, as though even in the act of eating he was calculating something. He asked his parents strange questions. How long could a body stay preserved in the earth? Why did people fear being buried alive? Did the soul linger near the corpse? And if so, for how long? His father dismissed these as morbid curiosities, but his mother wept quietly in her room. Old photos that survive from this period show the family sitting stiffly in the parlor. At first glance, it looks like a typical Victorian portrait: stern expressions, rigid posture, the long exposure blurring their eyes into lifeless smudges. But look closely at the boy. His gaze does not meet the camera. Instead, it seems fixed on his mother's hand, resting in her lap. His eyes appear calculating, as if he were studying her stillness, imagining it in death. The photograph is not merely a family image, it is a disturbing glimpse of unspoken terror captured on glass. It is said that the boy began leaving small tokens around the house. A dead bird arranged carefully in the center of the kitchen table, a moth pinned against the parlor wall. Once, his sister claimed she found a small doll lying in her bed, its face painted pale, its eyes shut as if mimicking the dead. The family never discussed these incidents openly, but each one added to the growing unease that clung to the household. One chilling rumor, whispered even decades later, told of the boy sitting silently at his mother's bedside while she slept, holding a pocket watch in his hand. He timed her breathing, listening for pauses, waiting for the moment her breath would falter. When she startled awake, she found him staring. He only smiled and whispered, "I thought you had gone." I was ready to record it. From that moment, she locked her door at night. The house had become a cage of dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight seemed to announce that the boy was still awake, still observing, still waiting. The silence of his attic experiments had begun to seep through the walls, infecting every room. Family dinners became hollow rituals. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the house itself carried the weight of his obsession. Neighbors began calling it cursed. Children dared each other to touch the front door, but none stayed long enough to knock. Passing by at dusk, one might catch the faint outline of his face in the upstairs window, expressionless, unblinking, watching the world as though it were nothing more than another experiment. The boy had not killed anyone, or at least not openly. There was no proof of crimes, no evidence beyond whispers and rumors. And yet the fear was real. It grew stronger each day, saturating the bricks, the curtains, the furniture. The house itself became a haunted place, not by ghosts of the past, but by a genius child whose fascination with death was more chilling than any spirit. In silence, in secrecy, the family endured. They did not speak of their terror, for to give it voice would make it real. But the unspoken truth was clear. They were living not with a son, not with a brother, but with something they no longer recognized as human. And though the house looked ordinary from the street, inside it was becoming a tomb. By now, the boy no longer hid his fascination. What began in silence, in the shadows of his attic, had seeped into his daily life. To him, death was not a subject to fear. It was a teacher, whispering lessons others refused to hear. And the boy listened. At school, while other children recited arithmetic or history, his notebooks were filled with sketches of bones, diagrams of coffins, calculations of decay. Teachers discovered strange essays tucked between his assignments. In one, he argued that death was not an end, but a process to be measured, observed, and understood. He compared the dying breath to the winding down of a clock. He described the still body as a machine waiting to reveal its final secret. The headmaster scolded him, urging his parents to restrict his readings. But the boy only smiled. He had already discovered medical texts, anatomical drawings, and the strange, forbidden world of post-mortem photography. Old photos fascinated him most. The stiff, lifeless children posed as if still alive, mothers clutching dead infants to their chests, families gathered around bodies that stared blankly into eternity. To most, these were disturbing images. To him, They were lessons, proof that death could be studied, cataloged, even preserved like science. In whispered conversations, classmates spoke of how he asked them chilling questions during recess. What would you think if your sister never woke up? Would you like to see what your face will look like in a coffin? One child burst into tears when he calmly described how long it might take for her father's flesh to turn to dust. The teachers punished him for cruelty, but the boy seemed unfazed. He was not being cruel, he insisted. He was simply curious. It was not only words. He began collecting dead insects, small birds fallen from trees, even a cat once rumored to have disappeared near the house. He studied them with precision, noting the stiffening of their limbs, the clouding of their eyes, the way life leaked slowly away. His notebooks became a grim archive, page after page filled with eerie details no child should have known. What disturbed those around him most was his calmness. There was no shriek of horror, no trembling at the sight of rot or bone. Instead, there was fascination, almost reverence. He spoke of death as though it were a stern but patient instructor, guiding him toward truths no one else dared to face. Neighbors began to say he carried himself differently. He walked with the stillness of a man twice his age. His voice grew slower, deeper, as if weighted by secrets. Some swore that when he spoke of death, his eyes darkened, not with shadow, but with something unnatural, something that seemed to look past the living and into the grave. There were stories of late-night gatherings, too. He would invite a classmate or two into the house, promising a game or a riddle, but those who accepted left pale and trembling. One boy confessed that the genius child had shown him a collection of dolls, each carefully posed to mimic the stages of dying. Another swore he had seen photographs hidden under the boy's bed, disturbing images of strangers, cut from newspapers, marked with dates and chilling annotations. 3 days after burial. Eyes clouded, muscles stiff. By this time, his parents no longer defended him. The father drank heavily, muttering that his son's brilliance was cursed. The mother aged rapidly, her face drawn and hollow, as though the weight of silence was crushing her. The family's decline mirrored the boy's rise into obsession. The more he studied death, the more alive he seemed to become, feeding on the very dread he inspired in others. And yet, there was brilliance in his madness. He spoke of concepts that mirrored scientific debates of the time, questions about the boundary between life and death, about the possibility of the soul lingering, about whether consciousness flickered even after the body lay still. In an era terrified of being buried alive, when bells were attached to coffins and doctors experimented with crude resuscitations, the boy's theories struck an eerie chord. Was he simply echoing the fears of his century? Or was he glimpsing a forbidden truth that even adults refused to touch? The most unsettling accounts describe him standing before a group of classmates, holding nothing but a pocket watch, swinging it gently. In a voice barely above a whisper, he asked them to close their eyes and imagine the moment their last breath escaped. Some fainted. Others ran screaming. But he stood calm, smiling faintly, as though death itself had just spoken through him. To the boy, death was no longer an abstract. It was a mentor, a constant companion, a figure he welcomed into his mind like a trusted guide. He believed he was learning secrets others would not dare to seek, secrets hidden in silence, in decay, in the graveyards that dotted the town like black scars. And so the genius child, once seen as gifted, was now regarded as dangerous. Not because he held a knife, not because he committed crimes, but because he spoke of death with love, because he listened to its lessons with the devotion of a disciple, and because, in his presence, others began to feel the icy touch of mortality creeping closer. The house whispered. The town trembled. And the boy continued to learn, continued to watch, continued to study death like science. What he planned to do with this knowledge, no one could yet imagine. Graveyards in the late 1800s were not quiet places. They were crowded, restless, overflowing with unease. In 1886, death was everywhere. Illness, famine, accidents that stole children in the night. Graves were dug shallow, coffins stacked close. And in this uneasy ground, the boy found his sanctuary. Neighbors began to whisper that he spent too much time among the stones. At first, they dismissed it as a child's morbid curiosity, lingering by the gates, tracing his fingers over names carved in fading marble. But soon, people noticed more. They saw him walking between the headstones at dusk, carrying a notebook, scribbling in the fading light. They swore he bent low over the earth, as though listening. Children dared each other to follow him, but none lasted long. One boy told his mother that he had seen the genius child kneeling at a fresh mound of earth, his ear pressed to the soil, as if waiting for a voice to speak back. Another claimed he heard him murmuring in a strange tongue, a forbidden language that sounded nothing like English, but closer to a chant, a rhythm, almost like the beating of a funeral drum. And then came the most chilling rumor that the boy answered back, not in words, but with nods, small whispers, as though carrying on a conversation with something beneath the ground. Old photos survive of that cemetery, faded and cracked with age. At first glance, they appear ordinary, rows of stones, skeletal trees, mourners in black. But look closely at one image, said to have been taken in 1886. In the background, almost blurred into the fog, a boy's figure stands alone among the graves. His head is tilted, his face shadowed, but his posture is unmistakable. He is listening. And though the photo was meant to capture a family mourning at a grave, the boy in the background steals the image. A ghost among the living. Soon, the townsfolk began to avoid the cemetery altogether. Widows hurried their prayers. Children clutched their mothers' hands tightly, refusing to let go. For the boy's presence there was unsettling, not violent, not disruptive, but patient, as though he belonged more to the dead than the living. Whispers followed him everywhere. Some believed he was trying to summon spirits, practicing a forbidden art that blurred the line between science and sorcery. Others said he was preparing himself, studying death until he could become immune to its terror. But the most disturbing rumor of all came from a gravedigger. He claimed he once caught the boy lingering too close to a coffin before burial, staring into its still face, lips moving faintly. When asked what he was doing, the boy only smiled and said, "I was listening. They still have something to teach." The gravedigger quit his job that very week. Inside the boy's notebooks, which some believe survived in fragments, there were eerie entries marked whispers. He wrote of nights when he heard voices not with his ears, but in his mind. He claimed the dead spoke in riddles, urging him to unlock truths hidden beneath flesh and bone. The entries grew more chilling as they progressed. The grave is not silence. The air still carries memory. They want to be heard. The family, too, noticed changes. At night, he would wake suddenly, eyes wide, murmuring names none of them recognized. His mother once swore she heard him pacing the hallway whispering to someone unseen, pausing now and then as though listening to a reply. When she asked who he was speaking to, he answered with a calm, chilling certainty, "To the ones who never left." The whispers began to follow him outside the graveyard. In class, he sometimes stared into the distance, lips moving silently. On the street, he would pause, head cocked, as though hearing a faint voice no one else could. Some said he began repeating phrases in that same forbidden language, a string of syllables that chilled listeners even though they could not understand their meaning. By now, the town's fear was not just rumor. It was conviction. People crossed the street when they saw him. Mothers drew their children close, and the church, once silent about the boy, began to speak of possession, of the dangerous lure of graveyard whispers. But whether these voices were real, or only in his mind, one thing was certain: the boy believed them. He carried the whispers like scripture, recording them, memorizing them, living by them. And slowly, he began to change. His eyes grew more hollow, his frame thinner, but his mind sharper, as though he were being drained of life by the very knowledge he sought. It was said that if you passed the cemetery late at night, you could hear it too. Not clearly, not in words, but a faint, low hum beneath the soil, almost like breathing. Some swore it was the boy's imagination infecting their own. Others feared it was proof that death itself had begun to speak, and only he had the genius, or the madness, to listen. And so, the genius child's education deepened. No longer just books, no longer just experiments in silence. Now, he claimed to hear lessons from the grave itself. But what knowledge could the dead truly give? And what price would he pay for listening? For months, the boy had drifted deeper into the world of silence, whispers, and graves. His family endured in quiet terror, the town shunned him, and still he pressed forward with his grim studies. But then came the night that changed everything. The night when whispers became screams, when shadows bled into reality, and the boy's fascination with death crossed a line that could never be erased. It began, as all rumors do, with a sound. Neighbors swore they heard something at midnight, an echoing cry that split the stillness of the town. It was sharp, human, and terrifying, but it ended so abruptly that no one dared leave their beds to investigate. The next morning, the boy's house was different. Its shutters still closed, its curtains still heavy, but the silence pressing from inside was heavier than ever, as though the house itself had drawn breath and refused to release it. What truly happened that night has been debated for over a century. Some say the boy carried one of his experiments too far, that an animal, perhaps a stray, perhaps something more, was taken into the attic and subjected to tests no child should have known how to perform. Others whisper something far darker, that a member of the family, perhaps his sister, perhaps a cousin, vanished from her bed and was never seen again. The official records from 1886 are vague, as if the town itself wanted to bury the truth. A simple note: disturbance at the house. No evidence of crime. Unresolved. But silence does not erase fear. Neighbors recalled seeing a lantern glowing in the attic for hours after the scream, its light swaying back and forth, casting monstrous shadows across the street. One man claimed he saw the boy's silhouette in the window, holding something in his arms. Too small, too fragile, to be a grown figure. Old photos said to date from just days after show the family post once again in their parlor. At first glance, it seems no different from earlier images. Pale faces, rigid postures, the heavy drape of curtains. But stare long enough, and the image reveals something wrong. There are fewer figures than before. A gap, small but unmistakable, between the mother and father, where once another child had sat. The absence is glaring, like a missing tooth in a frozen smile. And the boy, as always, does not look at the camera. His eyes are cast downward, as if staring into an invisible grave. The townsfolk began to murmur of a mysterious disappearance. They noticed the family withdrew even further. The mother stopped appearing in public. The father turned his face away when greeted. And the boy walked the streets more confidently, as though something had been resolved within him. No longer did he simply study death as an outsider. Now, he carried himself as if death had accepted him, as if it had become his companion. Some said the scream that night was not from within the house at all, that it came from the graveyard. A gravedigger, pale and trembling, claimed he saw the boy kneeling before a freshly covered mound, speaking in that same forbidden language. The earth shifted, he swore, though no one believed him. Yet even in disbelief, people avoided the graves for weeks. Whatever happened that night, it changed the boy forever. His notebooks grew darker, filled not just with observations, but with commands, as though dictated to him. Continue. Do not stop. The silence opens the door. The handwriting itself seemed altered, slanted, jagged, almost frantic, as though the words had been forced through his hand by something unseen. And it was not only the notebooks. His behavior changed. He no longer whispered in secret, but sometimes aloud, repeating strange phrases as though rehearsing them. His family flinched when he entered the room. His mother crossed herself in trembling hands. The younger children, if they remained, refused to sleep in their own beds. They huddled together at night, listening for his footsteps, praying he would pass their door. The town's fear solidified after this event. For now, the whispers of genius were replaced by words like curse, monster, and possessed. Few dared speak to the family, and those who did claimed the house smelled faintly of decay, though no body had ever been found. Still, no proof surfaced. No missing persons were declared. No grave was disturbed, and yet the memory of that scream lingered like a wound in the air. An unhealed scar that marked the precise moment when fascination became horror, when the boy's studies passed from obsession into legend. To the people, it was clear. Something had happened, something the family would never confess, something the boy would never deny. The genius child had crossed the threshold. Death was no longer his subject. It was his accomplice. What knowledge did he gain from that night? And what was the price, paid in silence, that the world would never fully uncover? In every story of dark history, there comes a moment when the subject simply disappears, swallowed by shadows, erased by silence, leaving only questions behind. For the boy who studied death like science, that moment arrived suddenly, and it left the town forever haunted. The whispers had grown unbearable. The scream from that night lingered in memory, and though no crime had ever been proven, people knew. They avoided the family house entirely. Some crossed themselves as they passed by, others spat on the ground to ward off evil. The town was suffocating under the weight of unspoken suspicion, and at its center stood a child whose brilliance had become indistinguishable from madness. And then, one day, he was gone. No farewell, no explanation. His seat at school remained empty, his footsteps no longer echoed in the cemetery, his pale face no longer appeared in the attic window. The genius child who had terrified his family and unsettled an entire town had simply vanished. The official word was simple: the boy has been sent away. But no records exist of where or to whom. No train ticket, no letters, no documents in church or city archives. He was there, and then he wasn't. Some believed his parents, worn down by fear, had committed him to an asylum far from town, where his obsessions could be hidden from public shame. Others whispered that he had been taken by forces darker than human law, that the whispers from the grave had finally claimed him, pulling him down into the soil he listened to so intently. Old photographs only deepened the mystery. The family posed once again in their parlor. At first glance, it is ordinary. Father, mother, two surviving children. But look closer, there is no sign of the boy. His place is empty, as though he had never existed. Stranger still, some claim his outline remains faintly etched in the photograph's shadow, a blur beside the chair where he once sat. An unsettling phantom, half erased, neither present nor absent. The town gossiped in hushed tones. Some swore they saw him wandering the graveyard weeks after his disappearance, his figure pale in the moonlight, vanishing the moment anyone drew near. Others believed he had hidden within the house itself, retreating to the attic, living silently in the walls while his family pretended he had gone. Children dared each other to knock on the door and listen for footsteps above, but none stayed long enough to prove it. The most chilling rumor came years later, long after the family had moved away. A new family purchased the house. While clearing the attic, they found a small wooden box wedged between the beams. Inside were notebooks filled with the boy's handwriting. The pages were fragmented, written in his strange forbidden language, scattered with sketches of bones, diagrams of coffins, and eerie phrases like, "Not gone, only waiting. Death teaches best in silence. I will return when they stop watching." No one knows if those notebooks still exist. Some say they were burned immediately, too disturbing to preserve. Others whisper they remain hidden in private collections, relics of a child's descent into darkness. The boy himself was never seen again. Not in town records, not in photographs, not in graves. His name faded, erased like dust from the margins of history. Yet the stories remained. Mothers warned their children not to wander the graveyard after dark. Teachers spoke of him in quiet tones, as a cautionary tale of genius twisted by obsession. And old men, sitting at the edge of taverns, told newcomers that the town had once been home to a boy who studied death until death itself claimed him. But absence is not silence. Over the years, strange stories continued to surface. Travelers swore they saw a pale young man boarding trains late at night, clutching a leather-bound notebook, his eyes hollow but unblinking. Others spoke of forgotten asylums where a nameless boy scribbled endlessly in journals, whispering to shadows. And in graveyards across the region, people claimed they sometimes heard faint murmurs at night, as though a child's voice was still listening, still learning. The vanishing of the genius boy was never solved. Perhaps he was taken away in secret. Perhaps he escaped into obscurity. Or perhaps he succeeded in what he always sought, to cross the boundary between life and death, and continue his studies from the other side. Whatever the truth, one thing remained. His disappearance left behind a wound that never healed. A mystery etched into the dark history of 1886. A reminder that genius and madness are often separated by the thinnest of lines. And when that line is crossed, the world is left with nothing but whispers, shadows, and photographs too unsettling to explain. The boy was gone. But his legend had only begun. The boy vanished, and with him, the truth of what happened in that house, in that town, in that year. 1886 was left scarred, not by an official crime, not by a recorded tragedy, but by something far more corrosive: silence. A silence that devoured the family, the neighbors, the church, and eventually, history itself. Yet his shadow remained. In old photographs, in whispered rumors, in the dread that clings to graveyards long after the mourners have left. The boy was never caught, never punished, never buried. He simply dissolved into myth, leaving behind fragments of notebooks and memories too dark to be spoken aloud. His story became part of the town's forbidden language, never written, only passed in low voices, always ending in uneasy silence. What legacy does such a child leave behind? To some, he was proof of what happens when brilliance burns too cold, when a mind sharper than its years strays too far into the abyss. To others, he was cursed, a vessel for voices that were never meant to be heard. But for everyone, he became a reminder of the sinister past hidden just beneath the ordinary surface of life. Even today, his tale lingers. Local historians speak cautiously of a genius boy who studied death like science, though they admit there are no official documents. Amateur researchers hunt for the missing notebooks, claiming they contain forbidden knowledge, secret codes, eerie details, unsettling history too dangerous for the public eye. Paranormal investigators have visited the ruins of the house, reporting strange sounds in the walls and whispers beneath the floorboards that seem to breathe. And perhaps that is his true legacy, not what he discovered, but what he left behind. The sense that death is not just an ending, but a presence, that behind the veil of silence lies something alive, something watching, something teaching. His obsession has become our unease. His whispers have become our nightmares. Look closely at the surviving photographs, those faded images lost in time. At first glance, they are ordinary, Victorian families, stiff and solemn. But study them longer, and you will notice shadows that do not belong, eyes that seem too hollow, and spaces where someone should be, but is not. In those absences lies the hidden truth, that the boy's presence never fully vanished. It lingers just out of sight. Some say he became one with the grave he loved so dearly. Others claim he walked still, moving from town to town, studying new cemeteries, adding new notes to his eternal research. And some believe he succeeded in his final experiment, that he crossed the line between life and death, not as a victim, but as a student, that he waits on the other side, ready to teach those who dare to listen. Dark history often leaves us with no answers, only questions that grow more haunting the longer we stare at them. Was he a genius cursed with unnatural curiosity? Or a vessel of something sinister? A reminder that death is not silence, but a voice? We may never know. But the boy remains, a ghost in the archives, a shadow in the photographs, a whisper in the graveyard wind. And so his legacy endures, not in textbooks, not in monuments, but in the fear he left behind. The genius child who studied death like science has become death's student forever. And his story warns us of one chilling truth: sometimes, those who seek to understand the darkness become part of it. The past is not gone. It waits, silent and patient. It lingers in forgotten events, in post-mortem photography, in the disturbing images left behind by strange families and vanished children. It seeps through haunted places, whispers from hidden truths, and echoes in the mystery of a life lost in time. And if you dare to listen closely, you may still hear him. Not in screams, not in cries, but in whispers. Whispers that crawl through the graveyard earth. Whispers that follow you home. Whispers that remind you the dead are never truly silent. This is the legacy of shadows. This is the story of the genius boy who studied death like science. And this is where his silence ends. If you look long enough into the shadows begin to look back. Some stories are forgotten for a reason. Some photographs are hidden because they do not just capture the past, they trap what should never be seen. The boy may be gone, but his lesson remains. Death is watching, and it is still teaching.